Hello, my name is Eva Orén. I'm the director of the Hagströmer Medico-Historical Library, where we are spending this evening together. And I'm also the head of the Unit for Medical History and Heritage at Karolinska Institutet here in Stockholm. A very warm welcome to all of you this beautiful spring evening. This evening we have gathered in the library to listen to the 2017 Hagströmer Lecture. This is a yearly lecture with an internationally renowned historian who addresses a subject that is currently debated in medicine, healthcare, or the life sciences, and who discusses this debate in relation to historical context. This year's Hagströmer lecturer is Nancy Toms, who is Distinguished Professor at State University of New York at Stony Brook, where she's taught history since 1978, after she earned her PhD in history from University of Pennsylvania, where she studied with Charles E. Rosenberg. Toms is one of the most prominent historians of medicine in the United States, and she has authored 4 books. First, A Generous Confidence, Thomas Story Kirkbride and the Art of Asylum Keeping in 1984. Then Madness in America, Cultural and Medical Perceptions of Mental Illness before 1914 with Lynn Gamwell in 1995. And third, The Gospel of Germs, Men, Women, and the Microbe in American Life in 1998. And most recently, Remaking the American Patient, How Madison Avenue and Modern Medicine Turned Patients into Consumers, which came out in 2016. She has also co-authored 2 collections, Medicine's Moving Pictures with Leslie Regan and Paula Treichler in 2007, and Patients as Policy Actors with Beatrix Hoffman, Rachel Grob, and Mark Schlesinger. In collaboration with Duke University Library's Special Collections, she developed Medicine and Madison Avenue, a very interesting website on the history of health-related advertising, and I really recommend that you all check that out. Nancy Toms' research has been supported by numerous important foundations in the United States, among them Rockefeller Foundation, the National Institute for Mental Health, and the National Library of Medicine. And she won both the American Association for the History of Medicine's Welch Medal and the History of Science Society's Davis Prize for the Gospel of Germs. And that book also happens to be one of my personal favorites, all-time favorites, in the history of medicine. In 2011, the American Public Health Association awarded her the Arthur Wieseltier Award for her, quote, distinguished body of scholarship in the history of public health, unquote. And she received the very prestigious Bancroft Prize in 2016 for Remaking the American Patient. And from 2012 to 2014, she also served as president of the American Association for the History of Medicine. And from our discussions over the past few days, I know that Nancy has many interesting plans and projects going on, not least her continued work on patients in mental health care institutions. And she has developed some of this work together with a documentary filmmaker. And I'm sure this is something that will also interest many of you in the audience. So after Nancy's talk, you will have a chance to ask her questions. And after the Q&A, there will be a reception, which you are all very welcome to attend. So with no further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Nancy Toms.
Okay, now the sound check. How is that? Are we okay? I have 2 sets on, so if I seem a little, it's going to take me a minute to get used to it, but you can hear me. Good, good. Well, thank you so much for the invitation to be here tonight. I'm amazed at so many people who left that spectacular weather to come here and to hear me. I thank you for that. I welcome this chance to talk about my book with a European audience, even though I'm not so sure how relevant the American experience is outside the United States, and we're about to find out tonight. My book explores why it is that patients in the United States are told they must shop carefully for doctors and medical services in order to get safe, affordable, and effective care. As I show, the idea of the patient who shops reflects this synergism between modern American medicine and modern American consumer culture. Although that dynamic is not absent in Western European countries, the greater market orientation of medical professionals in the United States, combined with the idea of medical care as a privilege and not as a right, have proven fertile ground for the development of what I term medical consumerism. In my talk tonight, I'm going to focus on one facet of this medical consumerism, namely patient use of the internet. I thought this would be an interesting topic given that the number of so-called e-patients is on the rise here in Sweden, as well in other parts of Europe. And since the internet allows for developments in one country to move quickly to another, cross-cultural comparisons are all the more useful. And although a very different form of e-medicine, the recent ransomware attack that shut down the National Health Services databases suggests that a better understanding of our collective vulnerabilities might be timely as well. So tonight I'm going to try to put the American e-patient movement in historical perspective, with the hopes of stimulating an interesting discussion. So let me start with two very different views of the contemporary e-patient in the United States. In 2009, a blogger named Carolyn Thomas posted an article on her website, Heart Sisters, titled, "What Doctors Really Think About Women Who Are Medical Googlers," based on the popular browser. She described there how she became what she called the doctor's worst nightmare, namely a patient who arrives in the office having read up on her condition via the internet. Thomas explained that she became a medical Googler after an emergency room physician misdiagnosed her heart attack as acid reflux disease, a not uncommon mistake due to physicians' lack of familiarity with how differently cardiac symptoms present in women compared to men. After her close call, Thomas retired from her job working at a hospice and became addicted, in her words, to researching heart disease and sharing what she learned with other women. Not surprisingly, Thomas's addiction affected her relationship with her personal physician. For example, because of her persistent searching, she knew before her cardiologist did that the Food and Drug Administration had issued an alert advising physicians not to prescribe the drugs Plavix and Wellbutrin together. While her doctor was not bothered by Thomas's initiative, she observed that many physicians viewed the internet using patient as a nuisance. As evidence, she cited the 2007 Time magazine piece, "When the Patient is a Googler," written by an orthopedic surgeon named Scott Hegg. He described the informed patient as the modern physician's cross to bear. In his experience, medical Googlers were, I'm quoting, "often suspicious and distrustful. Their pressured sentences burst with misused, mispronounced words and half-baked ideas." He wrote of one woman, "Susan had neither the trust of a nurse nor the teachability of an engineer. She would ignore no theory of any culture or any quack regarding her very common brand of knee pain." Among doctors, Haig wrote, patients like Susan were known as brain suckers. He got rid of her by referring her to a colleague, and it was probably someone he didn't like. Thomas and Haig's commentaries reflect the positive and negative poles staked out in the last decade in descriptions of these so-called medical Googlers or e-patients. That debate reflects a dramatic rise in the number of Americans able and willing to use their personal computers, and now their cell phones as well, to access multiple sources of health information via the World Wide Web. The Pew Foundation's Internet and American Life project estimates that 80% of American internet users, that's 93 million people, have gone online to get medical information in the last year. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Opinion is mixed. On the one hand, advocates of patient engagement see the internet as a positive and potentially transformative force in American medicine. In the words of Dr. Tom Ferguson, one of the early pioneers of the e-patient movement, quote, individuals who are equipped, enabled, empowered, and engaged in their healthcare decisions can help us heal healthcare. Within policy circles, where frustration over the failure of healthcare reform is at an all-time high, this new breed of informed health consumer is hailed as the magic bullet, literally, to correct the healthcare system's flaws. And here's the wiki definition of e-patient that gives you a flavor of this optimistic view of how increasing access can be a force for the good. Yet this new breed of informed health consumer has aroused resistance as well, especially among physicians. While reluctantly openly to question the official policy line about the virtues of patient engagement, these critics doubt that patients can be useful partners in their treatment, much less policy reform. Both anecdotal evidence and survey research suggest that many American doctors share Scott Haig's dislike of having to interact with internet-savvy patients, resentment reflected in the Google Mug campaign. Here you can buy this mug at Amazon for $12, and there is a matching poster as well. The same animosity is expressed in cartoons, which I have learned to value as a historical research. And let me just show you a few examples from my collection of many. The hairy doctor with a woman patient waving a sheaf of papers marked internet. I'm dead and it's your fault. This is a fun one. And then here's Dr. Google. In response to these concerns, researchers are now trying to assess how patient use of online sources is transforming the patient-doctor relationship in the United States, and I will talk more about their findings later in my talk. But before we go there, I want to draw your attention to one assumption that all the parties to this debate make, that the internet represents a radical break with the past, that prior to the internet, this is a sociologist, health information was almost exclusively available to health professionals. Or as someone commented on Carolyn Thomas's blog, quote, whatever did we do before the age of the internet when it could take days of endless, tedious sifting through sterile medical stacks to find anything useful to the average patient? Well, I'm here tonight to tell you that this assumption that the internet created the informed patient is just plain wrong. Yes, the expansion of the internet with its sophisticated web browsers and links to multiple vendors of information is a truly significant development. But the fundamental conflicts it raises over patients' access to information, where it comes from, how reliable it is, and how it affects their trust in their doctor are not new at all. The current discussion of e-patients replicates a pattern that historians of technology are very familiar with, that when first introduced, new innovations are always treated as radical breaks with the past, having no continuity with what came before. But as I will show, there was no information desert before Google or Facebook came along. And when it comes to content, much of what American patients find on the internet is not radically different from what they sought out in forms of old-fashioned print and electronic media, radio, TV, and what was circulated through patient self-help groups, again, long predate the internet. Now let me be clear, there are aspects of the new connectivity that are really new, and I'll talk more about what I see as really new later in my talk. But to recognize what's different about today's new breed of informed health consumers, we need a better appreciation of the ways that they are following in the footsteps of previous generations, including the women patients who in the 1970s started coming to their doctor's offices armed with a copy of Our Bodies, Ourselves. It's the 1971 edition on the left and the 2011 edition on the right. So today I want to introduce you to some of these information seekers and the debates they sparked within the medical profession earlier in the 20th century. As I hope to show, greater access to information has not magically created disturbances in the healthcare system. Rather, those disturbances have persistently fueled patients' determination to acquire more information in the first place. My objective here is not simply the kind of gee whiz, this has been going on forever, that historians like to do, but rather to stimulate a more sophisticated view of the internet's impact. Without awareness of the long-term issues and conflicts swirling around the informed patient, we respond to the dilemmas created by the internet with simplistic fixes that are not likely to work. Now, by focusing on the 20th century, as I'm going to do tonight, I do not mean to imply that patients challenging their physicians with information gotten from other sources did not happen before 1900. All the historians in the audience today know, as I do, that if you look anywhere in the past, the early modern period, the Enlightenment, the 19th century, we find comparable controversies. The combination of growing literacy and cheap print has been a fertile source of popular questioning of medical authority for centuries. While by no means unprecedented, though, I think it's fair to say that the 20th century brought significant changes to the circulation of information. Sweeping changes in medicine, advertising, and mass media meant that doctors and patients made choices within a rich and rapidly evolving information environment. Many innovations introduced then are still part of our medical landscape today. Physicians' advice columns, articles about the latest miracle or diet, and lots of drug advertisements. Patients came to the doctor's office having been exposed to the efforts of many different parties other than doctors to gain their attention. And this is a photo of a patient being seen by Dr. Dana Atchley, a clinical professor of medicine at Columbia. In fact, she was his secretary. She was posing to be his patient there. But you look, most people, if they look at that photograph, think, oh, there's that sweet lady sitting in that chair. She wouldn't dare to ask him any questions. I look at that and I think she might well have arrived ready to talk about what she had heard on the radio for an over-the-counter drug or read in a recent article in Good Housekeeping magazine. Then as now, doctors regretted having to waste time, as they thought of it, clearing away all the underbrush of prior knowledge that patients brought into the office. And root around in the popular and the medical literature of the mid-20th century, as I did, you will find a lively and remarkably familiar sounding debate going on about what to do with patients exposed to potentially misleading sources of information, misleading at least from their doctor's point of view. Of course, unless the patient is unconscious, physicians always have to be educators to explain to patients their diagnosis and their treatment plans in order to gain their compliance. But for many reasons, this education got steadily more complex after World War I, as treatment moved from homes to doctors' offices and hospitals. Medical specialties proliferated and developed new diagnostic technologies, medical procedures, and treatments that then spread into general practice. The nature of the diseases being treated also changed. By the 1920s, heart disease and cancer had replaced communicable diseases as the leading causes of death in the United States. The medical encounter increasingly revolved around conditions that lasted longer and were more difficult to cure. making trust and cooperation between doctor and patient all the more important. Now, given the enhanced evidence base and technical wizardry that American physicians steadily acquired after World War I, you think the process of getting that trust and cooperation would become easier. Like the Google mug, the message seemed obvious. Your doctor knows more than you do, so just listen and do what he tells you. To some extent, that deference did happen in the mid-20th century. The mass media celebrated medical miracles such as antibiotics, the polio vaccine. Public opinion polls suggested that many Americans had a high degree of faith in their personal physician. Yet, ironically, the evolution of American medicine also provided fertile ground for the commodification of information and encouraged some patients to start using it in not so deferential ways. Now let me pause here and say that diversity is a key point in what I'm going to be talking to you about tonight. Not every American patient went down this road seeking out new information. And in fact, today's analysis of internet using patients shows a diversity of what people want from their doctors and how much information they want to acquire. I can map this same range there by the mid-1900s in the United States. And the people I'm going to be talking about are the ones that are at that high level of involvement. They are there long before the late 1960s, which is often seen as the time period when this new orientation developed. For a variety of reasons, the peculiar evolution of American medical science and professionalism produced fertile ground for the genesis of patients at that, going up toward that involved pole on this diagram. That fertile ground reflects the distinctive features of the American medical profession, which went from a state of weakness in the mid-19th century to a position of strength in the early 20th century. Riding the success of modern scientific medicine, the American profession enjoyed a much greater degree of autonomy than did its European counterparts. But it was also much less centrally disciplined, and it faced steady competition from alternative healers. Hence, it was essential that the medical profession court the support of informed patients, particularly well-paying middle-class patients. Those patients had to be educated to stay away from healers that the mainstream profession thought were quacks, osteopaths, chiropractors, Christian Scientists. To this end, the mainstream profession worked hard to inform the American public about how to find a good doctor, to look at their medical degrees, to see what medical societies they belonged to, and to look at their hospital ties. In addition, the mainstream profession faced an endless battle to keep the public from, again, wasting, in their view, their money on useless drugs and treatments. Modern medicine emerged in the United States in tandem with a very robust consumer culture aimed at selling health-related products that did not require a trip to the doctor's office. And the American drugstore is a marvel in terms of how it evolved in this period. This is from a 1948 Life magazine story about all the hoopla surrounding the opening of a drugstore in California. So at the same time the medical profession was training people to go to the right doctor, they were also trying to train them to resist the over-the-counter allures of the modern drugstore. The informed patient had to know when to put that bottle of tonic down and go to the doctor, a challenge all the greater because those over-the-counter drugs were so widely advertised. Some of you may be familiar with the American actor Betty White. This is Betty White doing a TV ad for Geritol, a heavily advertised tonic whose ads our Federal Trade Commission fought to get off to change for decades with no success until 1976. So my little lady in the doctor's office might well have been coming in and asking about Geritol. But there was a fundamental dilemma in this professional imperative to educate patients to spot the good from the bad. Lay people taught to be savvy shoppers when it came to avoiding a medical quack or a dubious tonic did not necessarily keep their eyes trained only on those problems. A small minority began to look critically at matters the mainstream profession would rather they not look at. Habits of critical thinking that doctors encouraged when patients were contemplating a Christian Science practitioner or a bottle of pills in the local Walgreens were not so welcome in the doctor's office. The so-called American way of medicine, with its emphasis on personal relationship, picking the right doctor and the right drug, encouraged patients to gather and critically assess information. As I mentioned earlier, this kind of mentality, shopping mentality, began to develop long before the 1960s, the usual starting point for histories of patients' rights movements in the United States. It was a minority position, to be sure. College-educated, white, professional Americans were the kind of leading edge. But once you start looking for it, I found it in a lot of surprising places. I'm just going to give you a few examples of this shopping mindset before the 1960s. Starting with the Great Depression. As part of a broader middle-class concern with getting their money's worth, the title of a bestseller in the late 20s, techniques of shopping carefully for items such as automobiles or radios spread to over-the-counter drugs as well. The 1930s equivalent of a medical Googler would have been someone known by the curious term a guinea pigger. And it was a term that doctors used to describe people who had read one of the guinea pig books, so-called. This is the first and most famous of them, written by 1930s consumer advocates. And the 100 million guinea pigs in that picture are the American people. So it's filled with chapters on how to avoid buying bad drugs and also bad food. Now, in guinea pigs, the references, the original guinea pigs direct references to doctors were quite indirect, but these same consumerists, critical shoppers, also began to cast a critical eye on medical services. And I'll just show you here a 1935 article titled "Shopping for Medical Care," which appeared in Consumers Research Bulletin. The author, a former nurse named Catherine Kellogg, argued that in shopping, these are her words, in shopping for medical care, it is necessary to be even more skeptical and vigilant than in shopping for food and clothing. Her article outlined a range of practical steps that patients could take to protect themselves from bad doctoring, checking the physician's qualifications before agreeing to treatment, securing copies of their own x-rays and lab reports so they could get second opinions, and reading up on the current state of medical knowledge, 1935. By these measures, she confidently predicted medical care will improve mightily under intelligent consumer demand. Kellogg's approach is strikingly similar to our modern day expectations of how an American patient is supposed to behave. But in the 1930s, this advice that patients read up on their conditions and challenge their physician in any way did not sit well with American doctors, including the many physician subscribers to that bulletin. One of them wrote, deriding, quote, "the suggestion, which is nothing short of silliness, that the patient read up on his condition via the Index Medicus." In the mid-1930s, the consumer movement split over just how critical to be not only about physicians, but also about capitalism in general. The more conservative wing left medicine and doctors alone, the more progressive wing did not. And as a result, they got labeled a communist organization in the 1950s, and the doctors affiliated with them underwent harassment. Yet because of their loyal subscribers, the Consumers Union, as it was called, and its periodical Consumers Report, survived, and its publications became a bridge to the 1970 consumer health revolution. Among them, this is a collection of the articles they published on prescription drugs as well as over-the-counter drugs in 1961. Even though foes of critical consumerism like to paint the impulse to question doctors as a sign of your communist sympathies, in fact, the information gathering impulse was not confined to the American left. Post-war principles of free enterprise made it all the harder to swat down the idea of the patient who shops, as well as to suppress news stories about medicine's failings and the need to be a wary patient. Critical views were not just confined then to guinea pigger publications, but also termed up in the kind of mainstream magazines of the sort that doctors routinely stocked in their waiting rooms. So let me give you one example, the press coverage of the debate over unnecessary surgery. As the number of operations began to rise in the 1950s, so did debates among physicians over whether all these operations were necessary. In a pattern that would frequently repeat itself in years to come, what started as an in-house argument in medical conferences and journals got picked up by a national magazine, in this case, U.S. News and World Report, a conservative-leaning periodical aimed at providing businessmen with, quote, news you can use. It's still the motto of U.S. News. And that included coverage of the latest medical developments. In February 1953, the magazine carried a lengthy interview with Dr. Paul Hartley, the director of the American College of Surgeons, which offered a disturbing insider's view of medicine's entrepreneurial culture. And this is just the lead-in to Hawley's interview. Hawley described in detail unethical practices motivated solely by the desire to make higher fees, including unnecessary operations such as hysterectomies and tonsillectomies. Echoing Kellogg's suggestions in 1935, he emphasized the need for lay people to protect themselves by exercising greater care in the initial choice of a physician, shopping. Switching doctors if they spotted the telltale signs of unethical behavior, and he listed them, and reporting suspicious behavior to the local medical society. Hawley's interview, again, provoked an outcry from his fellow physicians that became a news story in and of itself. For example, when at its June 1953 meeting, the AMA delegates introduced 11 different resolutions calling that Hawley be censured for his statements. The national newspapers and magazines carried that story as well. Hawley, by the way, remained unrepentant. But in the meantime, the unnecessary surgery story got picked up by another widely read magazine, Reader's Digest. When doctors complained about patients getting bad information from reading a magazine in the 1940s and 50s, chances were good that it was Reader's Digest that it had in mind. Founded in 1922 by the very conservative DeWitt and Lila Wallace, the Digest depended primarily on reprinting abridged stories from other magazines, but it did commission a small number of original articles, many on health-related themes, from popular science writers. Paul de Kruif was one of their authors. Another Digest author specializing in medical issues was Lois Maddox Miller, a well-respected science writer who won the Lasker Foundation's Medical Journalism Award in 1958 for her articles about cigarette filters. In August 1953, she wrote this article for Reader's Digest, and I apologize for the poor quality. Reader's Digest is considered such a low life that it's very hard to find the originals. This is a copy from microfilm. Hysterectomy, medical necessity or surgical racket, which echoed Hawley's warnings. In her words, where the hysterectomy is clearly needed, it is a life-saving, health-restoring operation. But it had now become too commonly adopted. As evidence, Miller cited surgical audits done in several areas of the United States in which physician reviewers found that in a quarter to a third of the cases examined, there was no evidence to justify the hysterectomy. Now, while Miller blamed women for pursuing the surgery to evade pregnancy or uterine cancer, she also criticized the willingness of surgeons to be so easily convinced to perform the procedure. It was up to women to learn to seek out good surgeons who would resist this easy option. This kind of magazine article outraged doctors who complained loudly in the 1950s about the bad press they were getting. But their complaints had limited impact in that information had become a commodity in and of itself. Stories about medicine, whether it was the latest miracle or the latest controversy, sold magazines and newspapers. Nor could the medical profession avoid producing fodder for these kind of stories. As medical knowledge exploded, so too did internal variations in treatment. So the layperson who decided to consult the scientific literature to find out if a procedure was recommended might well discover that physicians were badly divided, often along specialty and generational lines. The idea of the random controlled trial was in its infancy, so determining the scientific value of specific treatments was extremely hard, still is, and even as better data emerged, unanimity was hard to find. In the meantime, even the kind of magazines routinely stocked in the doctor's office might inspire readers to come away with the thought, best beware, you need to trust and verify the doctor's advice before you follow it. Thus, long before the 1970s, this minority of American patients had begun to practice and advocate for this informed patient as a watchdog, and to support organizations and publications that gave them useful information in this role. In the pre-1970 phase of medical consumerism, the role of middlemen and middlewomen was especially important. Lay popularizers, again, typically white, middle class, and well-educated, elbowed their way into medical libraries, took notes, and produced writing designed to alert their fellow patients to the problems surrounding untested procedures or new drugs. Yes, they face barriers in getting access to information. For example, some, especially university medical libraries, only allowed physicians to use their collections. The publishers of the famous Merck manual would not sell copies to anyone but a physician until the 1960s. But these information hunters persisted, often finding a sympathetic doctor to get materials for them, or finding a public library that would let them in and let them get access to important volumes. As the problems in the US healthcare system escalated in the 1960s and 70s, this quest for patient health information broadened and intensified. Middlemen and women continued to be important, but more and more sources opened up directly to patients themselves. I can only sketch briefly here the underlying reasons for this widening in the 1970s. Among them, as medicine and pharmaceuticals became ever big business, their economic behavior came under more hostile scrutiny. The various rights movements of the post-war period, civil rights, women's rights, patients' rights, made patient consumers more inclined to question medical authority. And perhaps most importantly, the 1960s brought to maturity a generation of Americans far more prosperous and better educated than their Depression-era parents, who were more willing to participate in this criticism of the so-called medical establishment. As one doctor wrote of college students in 1974, they were, in his words, a new breed of patients who would be far more assertive than their parents had been and were going to, quote, insist that you explain what you're doing, end quote. This new breed of patient proved to be an enthusiastic reader, spurring ever more outlets of consumer-oriented health advice. Over the course of the 1970s, the number of health-related titles increased to about 1,000 books per year. New print and paper technologies allowed the production of better quality paperbacks, which in turn fostered publishing on more specialized topics such as alternative healing, diet and nutrition, women's health, as well as the management of specific ailments. The health and self-care sections of American bookstores grew dramatically as a result. And meanwhile, mass market magazines and newspapers continued to carry many articles concerning healthcare issues. Between 1970 and 1980, the number of pages devoted to health and medicine in the Reader's Guide to Periodical Literature increased nearly tenfold. Now, compared to their 1950s antecedents and their 1930s antecedents, this literature was far more openly critical of doctors and supportive of patients' rights and abilities to make decisions about their own care. That tone is evident in Our Bodies, Ourselves, which I mentioned earlier in the talk. The women's health movement was very important in this feisty mood, but it's evident in many other bestsellers from the period. Joe Graydon's People Pharmacy. Graydon is still an active voice in health popularization, and this was one of the most popular books for the new consumer, Take Care of Yourself, written by physicians. As the author of a 1970 guidebook for sick people noted, quote, consumers, sometimes known as patients, are insisting with considerable success that they deserve not just a piece of the action, but a piece of the knowledge. And as a result, the passive role of the patient is passé. This print-based consumer health revolution overlapped with the beginnings of computerized indexing in medical libraries, a move initially designed to help busy doctors find articles, but eventually started to aid patient-consumer access as well. And especially in institutions where taxpayer dollars were going to support medicine, the ability of medical libraries to keep out patients started to decline in this time period as well. Over the course of the 1970s, this idea of this informed patient moved from an outsider position associated with neurotics, communists, or health faddists to growing respectability. And as other reform measures, such as health planning boards, physician review organizations, failed to bring down prices and improve the quality of medical care, politicians and policymakers on both the right and the left became receptive to the idea of enlisting these informed patient shoppers as allies. The patient watchdog could be used to foster quality control in a medical world where innovation was frequent and professional oversight hard to sustain. And with the advent of Reaganism in the 1980s, fostering consumer choice in place of government regulation became an even more popular policy position. Now, let me briefly note one of the many ironies of this 1970s information revolution, and that was the legitimation it gave to new forms of health advertising. If there was anything that doctors and consumers agreed on, it was the evils of advertising. However, court rulings in the 1970s deemed that advertising was a useful form of consumer information, and these court positions led to the overturning of voluntary restraints on direct-to-consumer advertising of prescription drugs, as well as the lifting of the American Medical Association's centuries-old ban on physician advertising. Thus, starting in the late 1970s, a wide range of corporations and hospitals with deep pockets began to offer their own version of patient information. And this deluge of commercial advice and advertising only reinforced the call for more neutral assessments of what was good or bad medicine, and the spiral continues to this day. So this is the context for the 1990s discovery of the wired world. Far from being a radical development, there were many continuities in the development from print to digital forms of information. Here's the cover of Ferguson's 1996 book as kind of the beginnings of the e-patient revolution, published as a book. The policy position that information keeps a market healthy informed the enthusiastic embrace of the internet's resources as a tool for a new generation of informed patients. But this brings us back to where I started. How does this historical comparison help us understand the challenges presented by today's medical Googler? First, the long-range perspective reminds us that patient information hunting does not occur in a cultural vacuum, but rather arises as a response to conditions that already exist in the healthcare system. Patient use of the internet reflects the many problems that exist in that American system. Doctors with insufficient time, doctors and patients snowed under by a tidal wave of information and advertising, a complex and inequitable system of healthcare finance, and on top of that, specialization, just amazing. So it's not just one doctor you have problems with, it could be 5 or 10. Were patients perfectly satisfied with their medical care, they wouldn't be trolling for information in PubMed or alternativehealth.com to begin with. What the internet has done is make the hunting and gathering of information much easier, at least for people who are wired in, and I'll say more about that in a moment. But more importantly, the Web 2.0, as it's called, has vastly multiplied the interactive nature of the internet and the ease with which users can generate content and create virtual communities. It's this connectivity that makes the current internet web-based information so new and distinctive in my opinion. And this is just a slide from a talk by Lee Rainey, one of the, again, early observers of the e-patient, talking about the internet as the asteroid and comparing the old internet with the new internet. The 2009 is the 2.0 connected. So now you can not only click on a screen and open a static page of text, like opening the page of a magazine, but you can also connect with people around that content in a huge variety of ways, including email, blogging, Skyping, and social media, such as Facebook or Twitter. To appreciate that transformative potential, consider the contrast with the Our Bodies, Ourselves stories. In that volume, feminists in a small consciousness-raising group compiled a mimeographed sheaf of information and advice for themselves, and then got a publishing contract to make it available to other women as a book, and that you could bring it back into your small consciousness-raising group and keep it going. Now you can do that via the internet. You don't have to be in the same room. One of the most powerful capacities of connection is the opportunity for peer-to-peer support and information exchange. You can even meet fellow patients face-to-face via programs like Skype. Sometimes there seems to be a stereotype that when lay people talk to each other, they invariably embrace the most anti-medical positions. But here again, the reality is a lot more diverse. A website like Heart Sisters, although it's critical of doctors who don't know about gender and heart disease, is very pro-doctor in terms of trying to direct women to better information and more sympathetic healers. Connectivity also has the potential to enhance communication between doctors and patients, and among doctors about shared patients. So instead of phone calls, you can get an email with your lab results, and when you move from one doctor to another, your e-medical records supposedly go with you. It's not working so well, but that's the theory. So there are lots of opportunities for sharing that could make medicine better. And this is another enthusiastic schema about how this new e-patient works. But to be sure, making good use of all this potential is not easy. And let me just return to what is one of the most obvious problems, and that's unequal access. Even though the so-called digital divide in the United States has narrowed substantially in the last decade, groups we want very much and need to reach, the elderly, people of color, rural residents, and very, very poor people, are still less likely to have access to the internet. Keep in mind that in the United States, this information hunt, this is another problem, covers everything from the choice of a doctor to the choice of an insurance plan to the side effects of your prescription drugs. So there is an overloading. It's not just one thing you're looking up, you have to look up everything. And the scaling up of the requirements to be informed definitely favors privileged people who have more time to put into all this gathering and analysis. That said, I will note one study that showed that people who have limited access to medical care due to their insurance status are in fact more likely to go online to get information. So we can't assume that medical Googlers are all wealthy, entitled folk with time and money to burn. There is another issue or caution that I want to raise, and that is in the enthusiasm for the new web, we need to recognize its kinship with the historic information environment. And when I, as a historian, look at Tom Ferguson's, this is his famous upside-down pyramid from 1995 about how the internet is going to change the information hierarchy, I see something conspicuously absent there. And there is no allowance in the web's use as for advertising. Where are e-patients searching for you? Whatever you get in the United States that's informative, expect to see the commercial side get right in there and exploit the same connective capacity. In today's wired world, as Tim Wu has shown in his book, Merchants of Attention, commercial actors are well-financed, command great creative talent, and are relentless in their bid to bring advertising to every nook and cranny of the American life. And I'll just note a recent Stanford study with middle schoolers trying to see if, how well they could read information on the web, and spotting the difference between a website by the Mainstream Pediatrics Association and the website put up by the anti-vaccination movement. They could not tell them apart because the anti-vaccination website was set up perfectly as a mirror of the American Academy of Pediatrics. There is no way we can scrub the internet of this kind of information, much less all the other forms of questionable material out there on the World Wide Web. But let me repeat my earlier point. The problems with these new information technologies reflect already existing problems. The internet did not create them. It's the healthcare system that was already troubled. But now e-tools are not a magic wand. We can wave over all these dysfunctions and poof, make them go away. E-tools have both good and bad aspects, and we need to be patient in addressing their use. We need to beware of writing them off with simple tales of how ignorant or neurotic patients needlessly bother their doctors, and instead probe deeply into the characteristics of the doctor-patient relationship and the healthcare system that make Googling such an attractive option. So what about solutions? Well, I certainly don't think signs and mugs like this are the way to go. I think far better to recognize that patients trying to be better informed are here to stay. Far better to adopt the motto, if you can't beat them, join them. Skip the mug if you're a physician, I would say, and work with medical librarians who are the greatest people in the world, and other patient educators to draw up a list of resources. And I lost my last page. Find useful and want to recommend. To be sure, there are always going to be obnoxious or troubled patients and obnoxious and troubled doctors who will find bad ideas to latch onto. But that should not stop us from using the enhanced potentials of connectivity to push back against the very real problems that exist in healthcare today, starting in the United States with the relentless hollowing out and fragmentation of the time that doctors and patients spend together. There are a world of good ideas being tried out, and librarians are often leading the way in this regard. Physicians and nurses need not reinvent the wheel. There are information professionals out there who can help them and their patients learn how to use what's on the World Wide Web more skillfully. In conclusion, the debate about medical Googlers is at heart a debate about patient engagement. With or without the internet, the ideals of participatory medicine are hard to fulfill, but what choice do we have? I look forward to hearing your ideas about how to go forward. Thank you. Go. Yeah. I'm not, okay.
Thank you, Nancy. That was terrific. I'm going to use this microphone, and now it's your turn to pose some questions to Nancy. And if you want to stand up, please, and ask the question, we can better pick up the sound with a microphone. If you feel uncomfortable speaking in English, you can just ask the question in Swedish, and I will repeat it in English to Nancy. That is fine. And also, I think I might actually repeat every question just so that everyone hears what it is. So, please. The audience seems shy, so I will start.
We'll get there. They'll warm up.
While you figure out what you want to ask, I'm going to start asking you a question, Nancy. Thank you so much for a very interesting talk. And I was thinking there were several actors involved here in your talk. You talked about nurses, librarians, doctors, patients, drugstores, pharmaceutical companies, advertisers, and others, and they were all kind of, they seemed like they were acting on their own in some way. And of course they weren't. Yes. But especially when you were talking about the informed patient and the movement to get information out there for other patients to share, whether you go back to the 1930s or 50s or 70s or today. And then you were speaking about doctors and how they used various media to try to take control over the situation. But I was curious about, do you have any examples of collaborations between patients and doctors in order to find forms of information or interaction that could be used?
Yes. So one of the myths about any medical profession is that it's unified. And in fact, American doctors had a wide range of perspectives on these issues. And some of them were allies to these critical patient voices and would help them. So, for example, the Consumers Union had a doctor was one of its leading, he helped form their approach. They had to drop him from the masthead because he was singled out during the Red Scare for his supposedly left-leaning, so he's not there from the 50s, but that he comes back. So yes, there's definitely collaboration back and forth. I would say probably many of both the doctors and patients were kind of bound by the print restraints of their time period. So I don't want to, innovative in the sense of the visual presentation of their material. They seem very print oriented.
Thank you very much.
There comes a
okay, we have a few questions here. Right, first, right here, and then.
I have a question about the way this subject is currently treated in the medical curriculum of because obviously there's a new generation of doctors who've come up who are themselves avid Googlers. I go to the doctor, and of course the first thing he does is pull up my record. He hasn't even studied it usually before I get there. He's reading it. Sometimes I'll talk about, he'll Google something. Obviously he goes to maybe PubMed Central or some other, which I know of. I mean, and many lay patients know about all of these things. So I'm wondering whether there's any kind of formal way of kind of an ethics of this, and also best practices about this as it's being taught to the current generation.
All right, I'll just sum up the question briefly.
Oh, it's a good question.
A question whether there is any effort to make this kind of question a part of the medical curriculum and form a set of best practices.
I would say there's a lot of variation. There are some medical schools that have course material devoted to the patient-doctor communication. There are many others, and I'd say my own university, this is not seen as what doctors need to know. This is something they'll learn later in practice. It's kind of shocking to me, but well, maybe it isn't, in the sense that the real fight is over how many hours can you have for histopathology as opposed to, I don't know, neurobiology. And nobody wants to give up time to educating doctors about how to talk to their patients. They're much more likely as medical students to reach out. I mean, sometimes they do this and say, will you come and talk to us? So I don't think there's enough of a conscious outreach as yet, but maybe we're going to get there, and I think the generational issue that you raise is a very important one. When I look back at the 70s, the doctors who started writing those books about how to be how to communicate, how to be an educated consumer were younger. So I think that things may get markedly better. But Scott Haig was not an old, he was not an old man when he wrote that 2007 piece. So stay tuned. Yeah.
Very interesting. Thank you. And please.
My name is Ulf Bergman. I'm a clinical pharmacologist, so I'm very much focusing on the drug-related problems in the States and over here. One of our strong organizations in Sweden is the patients' unions. Are they available in the state, and are they powerful in that regard? Because we collaborate a lot as physicians in developing patient-physician relationships in this regard to a great extent, really. And we are really emphasizing the importance of patients, for example, in this county council, where a lot of information we are producing from the healthcare sector is meant for the patients.
Yeah. All right. Brief summary.
Yes.
The question was regarding patient unions and collaborations between pharmacologists and the different medical professions and the medical professions in general and the patient unions.
So I'd say in general, pharmacology has been more interested in this area than, say, other specialties because of the traditional or the long-standing need to explain medications to patients. One of the peculiarities of the United States is there's no such thing as a patient's union. One of the things I found in writing my book is that someone wanted to found the American Patients Association in 1953. But that idea, and actually drew up legal papers and had a whole board of directors, but that idea has never gone anywhere. Is it the size of the country? Possibly. Unfortunately, it's also this association of patients questioning with a kind of revolt against authority, so that the initial reaction among many medical societies was to think, we don't want to get anywhere near these people. Now, that has changed, and depending on the specialty area, but what I see happening is it's more around people with a specific disorder. So what you're describing, you see with people who have cancer becoming partners. What you don't see is any larger attention to what all patients share. And unfortunately, you get a little bit of cancer is the most important. We should focus here. Or diabetes type 2, we should be, and they compete with each other. So it's quite a mess.
Okay, so maybe it's a little more disjointed.
Disjointed, yes.
In the United States. Yes, please.
My name is Lisbeth Sachs. I'm a medical anthropologist, and I find it extremely unequal. I have been researching with migrant patients here, and of course they have view of the doctor who is authoritative.
Yes.
And is there any help for these kinds of, because you were talking about whites and well-educated and so forth, but is there a consciousness about this?
The question, if I may sum up, is regarding the inequality when, in terms of access to healthcare information and dialogue outside of the actual meeting with a doctor, and also the inequality in terms of in the patient-doctor encounter, if I understand you correctly, and if there are ways of addressing this and efforts to address these inequalities.
So one of my main concerns in writing that book was to show how much the mainstream idea of this informed patient depends on being white, middle class, and educated, and that what has happened in policy circles is that that idea, which might work reasonably well for that population, has been scaled up. So it's now presented as what every patient should do in the face of countless information, anecdotal but also survey research, that suggests that scaling up is going to be very difficult. If you're an undocumented immigrant, you're not going to ask those questions. If your first language is not English, you're not going to ask those questions. So I'm very aware of that, and people who are patient advocates are very aware of that. So yes, there's an extreme concern about how this as a policy solution is missing and not fulfilling the needs of people who don't fit into that informed consumer model. I wish I could tell you. I think the people who are trying to act as those intermediaries are living saints, in my opinion, but they get very little funding. They do it because they're passionate about the people they're trying to help. Do I need to tell you what a train wreck the American healthcare system is at the moment? It is chaos. I come from the land of chaos. So this very good point is we would all like to see more attention to. At this point, we are going back to, it's not even the 1950s. I'd say we're going back to Charles Dickens in the United States.
Yes, the situation is certainly different in different countries. I was thinking, to follow up on your question there, that there are very interesting efforts and initiatives in sub-Saharan Africa where health libraries team up with patient organizations and doctors in order to get medical information out there. And would you know it, the use of smartphones in sub-Saharan Africa is very, very widespread. And so the situation not only differs, of course, if we compare the United States and Sweden, but also in other parts of the world. And I don't know if you want to address that global aspect of it at all, or
I keep forgetting it's not there. One of the reasons I'm here is to find out more about how other parts of the world do things, and my assumption here is not that I have anything, well, there may be something in the American experience that you could find useful, but I think it's far more likely it's the other way around, that we have to learn from how other countries do things that could possibly help.
Yeah, thank you. Please.
Thank you very much. I was thinking about informed consent.
Yes.
I mean, the emergence of informed consent. And I mean, it may appear a bit provocative in a sense to link that to consumer culture.
Not at all.
But because there's a strong narrative about the emergence of informed consent from Nuremberg to Helsinki and so on. So would you like to elaborate on
Yes.
that? Because that's interests me.
So the question is regarding informed consent in conjunction with this patient information movement and over the course of history.
It's not something I put into this talk, but it is something definitely in the book because it is critically important. And I try to talk about, I mean, you have courts making decisions about what information patients have a right to get, but there's a shift in the juridical attitude in the United States where judges who up until the late 1950s let doctors alone. I mean, there was malpractice law and there were sort of rules about malpractice, but the larger question of informed consent was left to physicians, largely surgeons, but they stopped giving them a bye in the 1960s, and this whole huge body of case law about what informed consent means. And it is definitely part of this larger questioning of it's simply not enough to assert that you have scientific authority, you have to prove it. And of course, the legal rules for proving it are different from the scientist rules. So that's a very important part of the story. I think I do vary from the kind of classic view of informed consent in that I hook it up with this market-based, which has not been a point of view taken before.
Did you want to follow up on that, or
no?
We'll talk more. We'll talk more.
Yes, please. Oh, there. I didn't see it. Okay.
She's behind the, yeah.
Yes, please.
I'm Nina Nelson. I'm a pediatrician by profession. I work with quality and patient safety,
Yes.
and especially to improve at the Karolinska University Hospital the possibilities for patients and relatives to really improve an effective and development of healthcare. And I wonder, do you see any connection, and if so, between the possibility for the patient being a true partner and if there is regulations or even laws stating that, because there are differences in different countries in Europe, for example. Yeah. That's one question. Another question is, does it have any influence if the patient really owns the money to for the health care? So that's my two questions.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. This is all about how much money you have. I mean, that is the sin of the American healthcare system, is that the quality of your treatment is tied to your insurance plan. So that's a very important question. The other question you asked is very interesting is if you want to improve your healthcare system, you can pass laws that require the collection of information and then development of policies based on that. That has been a tricky bit of business because what's odd about the United States is you have agreement from Democrats and Republicans on this idea that you should involve patients, but their ideas of what that means vary. So the Republican view is, well, of course you want to encourage people, don't give me any regulation. And no, you don't have to think about how to do that. Just say you're going to do it and put it in your brochure that you're going to hand out. Oh, I meant to say in regard to informed consent, a lot of how this works in the United States is if you get the patient to sign off, whatever bad thing happens to them is the patient's fault. So informed consent has not operated in, I think, the way that its original sponsors hoped. It's become a fig leaf. It's a way you make sure you sign all those papers, and that protects you if somebody comes after you with a lawsuit. I'll just mention part of the Poor Affordable Care Act was regulation mandating the collection of information and the creation of a nonpartisan body to collect more data on efficiency, safety, and patient satisfaction. So that was part of the historic bill, or the law that was signed, that now my country, there's a war, it's a civil war over repealing it, and none of that is in Trump Care. Gone. They don't want it, because by letting anybody do whatever they want, more people can make money. I hate to be cynical, but that's, of course, the problem comes when this company wants to make money and this company wants to make money, and they're fighting with each other. That problem they haven't figured out how to resolve. But the bottom line is, you don't have a patients' union making those points. You have Corporation A arguing with Corporation B. Do I sound depressed? Yes. Everyone who has anything to do with healthcare policy in the United States is just like, we should be dressed in black sackcloth.
We have medication for depression.
See me after. Yeah. I may never go back. That's going to be the problem. Oh.
Thank you. We have a question over here, please.
Okay. I appreciate your description of the historic developments. And also, of course, that you point to the new technologies that give always some benefit and some problems. Yeah. But I think the interesting issue is how you balance the advantages and the disadvantages. And you point to the fact that the interconnectivity has good sides and bad sides. But to me, that's a little bit passive. As I see it, and I would like you to comment on it, interconnectivity gives a huge increase in opinions available. This is, of course, not only for medical issues, but particularly, in this case, critical. And you cannot handle that as long as you had 5, 10 alternatives to assess as a patient. And in addition, those alternatives had some kind of a credibility stamp on them. You could make some kind of informed decision. But now, with interconnectivity, you have hundreds of opinions coming from unknown sources, and you can still only handle a handful of them. So how do you pick the right ones? So isn't that a big problem?
That is a very serious problem, and you are wise to point it out. The only solution I see is bizarrely the same solution that these consumerists started putting forth in the 1930s, and that is, you have to you have to educate patients to ask the right questions. It's a really weak way to discipline this craziness. I'll also say we don't really know what's going on yet. I mean, that there's a lot of anecdote and concern. But we are starting to get social scientific research that is trying to look at what actually happens when people use these different information sources. And one thing I saw that I thought was quite interesting is that people have looked for, but not been able to verify, a single instance when a person got bad information off the internet and died as a result. Now, how they went about doing this, I don't know. But I think we're too soon in this process, and certainly when you were describing what you just described in terms of healthcare information, I was thinking about what's happening in the news media and the fake news and the sort of complete destabilization of what's a fact, the war on science. So you're not supposed to believe anything a scientist says. So on a bad day, I'm just in despair. On a good day, I think, well, maybe there's something in this we can save. But the problem you identify of multiplication and then the problem of telling the good from the bad, I think, is the studies of people's difficulty in evaluating the authoritativeness of information on the web is definitely not happy news. It's discouraging that people just can't tell.
Yes, and we have a question over here.
Thank you. Thanks for the segue to my question. I've been nurturing for some time here now. I'm not in the medical profession at all. I'm in information theory and particularly in search software and that kind of business. And one thing that strikes me when I'm in medical-related projects is the labeling language that varies tremendously. So if I put myself in the sort of the medical consumer perspective, and I want the comparability you're talking about, make sure that if I want a particular result, what kind of labeling should I use? And if I choose one label because I happen to know that one, there might be an ocean of relevant information over there, just talking about exactly the same thing, but with different labels. I think my question is there anything going on right now in the medical profession to sort of streamline this, to make information more efficient, what have you?
Well, on what side of your
Mesh.
Well, there's certainly mesh. Again, I really like medical librarians. I think that in a way they are one of the middle people who try to figure this out. You could argue that the evidence-based medicine and the attempt to do things like the Cochrane collaborations, and Cochrane, after prodding, started to get feedback from patients. They didn't have that in the beginning. It was very much a top-down model. That you can see some signs of that, but I countered that is the fast-moving pace of medical research, and a lot of what you do in an area is invent a new term or give it a new twist that makes it very difficult to keep up with in terms of the indexing for a physician, much less a layperson. Yeah, Mike.
And also, I would say all the terminology for drugs that differ in different countries. Right. The active substances and the brand names and everything, it makes it really difficult. Yeah. It's an interesting question. Yes, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to piggyback on it and say that proliferation is not just a problem for the medical consumer, it's a problem for the doctors as well.
Exactly,
There's just so much research, so much going on. Of course, the proliferation of drugs with fanciful names, it's hard to keep up with all of them, also with generic equivalent names. But I also think that even though we know that there's a large group of consumers who are willing to go to the Stem Cell Repair Institute instead of, and some other ones, which is a kind of quack organization that preys on people and does kind of bogus stem cell operations. But there has been an attempt to create, credible web authorities. Of course, PubMed being one, and then commercial variants, and also, I mean, Consumers Union has been is still very. If there's anything remotely resembling a patients' union in the United States, it's still something called Consumers Union,
that's true. Which
has issued books and has a periodical newsletter, and then so finally, it's of course it's a mixed bag, but I think people are becoming more, both gullible and savvy at the same time.
It's certainly the guideline movement to try to have best practices that I think has been a response to these dilemmas. But again, the research into how guidelines are used suggests that they aren't followed, and also if you get a guideline that this medical device maker doesn't like, they go and get some doctors to write a different guideline. So it's this really the problem of trying to figure out. My personal response to this is very simple. I try to follow what I've learned to find a physician I trust. And I think that is really a key, and work with that person. and try to limit my alternatives based on that. But it doesn't always work. And I would say one of the biggest problems in the history of the United States is the rise of specialism. You realize that the number of doctors we have who are generalists is pathetically few. We don't even have general internists anymore. Your primary care physician is a pediatrician, a gynecologist, or a family doctor. That's it. And their numbers are too few for people. I went through this to find a sort of generalist. American doctors, the young ones, they come in and they get put into a specialty, and each specialty then has its own guidelines, and then they fight within the specialty over the guidelines, and the patient is like, oh, what do I do?
You would be surprised how many similarities there
are.
Oh,
okay.
To
well,
the Swedish system, where we also have very few, too few generalists and primary care physicians, and that's a big crisis right now. Also, the reduced time that each patient gets to spend with a doctor is also a big problem here in Sweden. So one thing that's been a question of mine for a number of years now is reflecting on how certain problems in American healthcare can be so similar to the problems in Swedish healthcare, which has, of course, is socialized healthcare system, but where the economic driving forces end up having similar effects, even though the systems are so incredibly different. So I don't know if any of you who work as healthcare professionals who are here this evening would like to comment on that and take up that thread of discussion. Not quite. All right, but I see several of you nodding and smiling.
Well,
so
I can say that certainly one reason I'm here this summer is to go and work on the comparative side with a colleague in the Netherlands who's interested in exactly these issues, and we are going to try to start sorting out some of these issues and try to see what's similar and what's not. And I think it's a good corrective because Americans because we have such a bizarre financing system, blame everything on that. But in fact, we know that some of it is, I won't say intrinsic, but it's part of the modern commodification and procedure orientation of medicine in general. So it's a good question.
Yeah, and do we have any more questions?
I think they may be ready to drink now.
Yeah. This is actually a very good point at which to end the question and answer section of this. And thank you so much again.
My pleasure. Great question.
And please join us for a reception in the hall right outside here. Thank you all.